Guilty! 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 As I bang my gavel. I wish I had a gavel to bang. I once did. I don't know whatever happened to it. Made one when I was like in 8th grade or something. 7th grade, wood shop. This little gavel. I don't know whatever happened to it, but I don't have it anymore. Guilty! Did you know that you could be guilty of a crime that you didn't even do? If you discover that somebody committed a crime and you don't say anything, then you're guilty as well. Or if you're in a position where that is your duty to do something or act in a situation and you fail to or decide, oh, I'm just going to let that slide. That you too are just as guilty as the person who did that crime. And this is even in... Did I say it? I said it. Shh. May have to edit that out. How can I say that? Fraudervraud. Even in fraudervraud. Yeah, fraudervraud. So we're going to take a closer look at that and what it means coming up next.
And the people said, Amen.
Over the last few weeks, it's been a very trying time and a time that I've really grown closer to the Lord as we've been going through this election cycle. And I usually don't like to talk about politics or talk about topical issues. Would like to start another channel eventually that would be more along those lines. But for right now, I just really... I don't want to hinder anyone from coming to the Lord because of talking about politics. But so as I was praying, and I was praying again today for our nation, for the elections, for a president, for God's will to be done. These are all things you should pray for, regardless of who you voted for or what your political position is. If you are with God, you should lift up these things to God in prayer. And with that, I've just been seeking for God's will and what He would want to share with me in this. And I found myself reading in the book of Samuel today. Now, it's not a book that I normally read, hardly ever. And for some reason, that's where I was today. And as I began to read, it was an interesting story. It starts with Hannah, who is not able to have children, and that ends up that God blesses her, and she's able to have a child. And so this child is Samuel, of which the book is named. But interesting, even though she's been waiting for a child and finally gets one, she gives the child back to God. So she takes the child to live with Eli in the temple, who is the priest. So basically Samuel's being raised up in the traditions of priesthood, which must have been a very hard thing to do, right? If you've been waiting for a child. So it says that from the time that he was weaned, so he couldn't have been older than a few years old. And the interesting thing is that they only saw him like once a year after that. They would come to the temple for their normal temple rituals. But in the act of that, it goes on to say that because she gave Samuel back to God, God allowed her to have more children. And so she was able to have several more children. But it still must have been hard. Because even though you can have more children, that doesn't change the fact that that one child is not a part of your life in the same way anymore. And it turns out that Eli, who's the temple priest that Samuel goes to live with, he has these sons. And they are not doing what they're supposed to. In fact, they're pretty vile. So Eli's sons are doing this big no-no. They're getting their portion of the offering that's meant for God. So in fact, they make these forks that then when people come by with their sacrifices to God, that then they jab their fork in and whatever they pull up, well, that's for us. Kind of getting the choice meat, the choice part off of the sacrifice that's meant for God. And also before the animal was sacrificed, they would want their cut of it. And if the person didn't want to give it to them, they would take it anyway. So this was a lot of a wrongdoing. And we've seen history throughout history in the church, the Catholic Church and other denominations sometimes, and you've seen some funny business and some things that go on. And you've seen this in government as well, right? So Eli's sons have sinned against God. But even though that Eli did not do the sinning, he allowed this to go on. He knew it was taking place. So Samuel's living in the temple with Eli the priest. And it doesn't say how old he is at this point, but one night he goes to lay down and he hears from the Lord calling him Samuel, Samuel. He thinks it's Eli and he gets up and goes to him and he says, yes, here I am. Here I am. Your servant's here. And Eli says, what are you doing? Go back to bed. So, again it happens, Samuel, and he gets up and he goes to Eli, yes, here I am. Eli's there saying, what are you bothering me? Go back to bed, go back to bed. So finally, the third time when he gets up, Samuel, Samuel, and he goes to Eli, here I am, I heard you call me. And finally, Eli realizes, oh, I'm not calling you, but the Lord is calling you. So Eli tells him to go back and lie down, and when the Lord calls him again, say, speak, Lord, and then accept what the Lord has to tell him. Well, he goes back, and this happens, and the Lord tells him some things. Of course, the next day, Eli wants to know, what did the Lord tell you? And he tells him, tell me everything he told you, don't hold anything back. Well, it was bad news for Eli, because Eli had allowed his son to continue to do these things that violated the way things were supposed to happen. It was actually against God. So judgment was coming upon him and his house. The Lord said to Samuel, behold, I will do such a thing in Israel that whoever shall hear of it shall give heed. In that day I will perform against Eli all things which I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. And I will show him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew when his sons reviled the people, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity that Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifices nor offerings forever. Because Eli knew what was going on, and he did not rebuke them. He did not stop it. He allowed it to continue. He did not speak out. So I think that this was the message I was getting today from this, is that there's two kinds of guilt. There's the guilt of the person who does something wrong, and they know it's wrong and they shouldn't do that. And then there's the guilt of the person who knows of the person that did wrong and lets that continue and doesn't stop it and doesn't speak out against it or do something. Then the story goes on that they're in this battle situation against the Philistines, and they get the idea of, let's bring out the ark so we can have God's favor with us. They bring out the ark to give them this edge, and in watching the ark is Eli's sons, and here comes the enemy. They are defeated, and they seize the ark, and they kill Eli's sons, and then they take the ark back with them. He knew when they were coming to tell him that the ark had been taken, come to tell him that his sons had died. See, he knew that this was going to happen. It had been prophesied. Now it says that Eli was sitting upon a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And then a man came returning from the battle to share with Eli what had happened. And as he approached, Eli could hear the noise of crying. And he said, what is this noise? And the man came hastily to tell Eli. And he starts out with telling him that his sons had died, and that's a big enough blow, right? But then he also tells him that the ark has been taken. And it seems to be in the reading that this is what Eli was really concerned about. I don't think he was very concerned about his sons who were doing wrong, and he knew judgment was coming. Maybe he had talked to them, maybe he had tried to warn them before, and they were just caught up in their evil ways. They couldn't be reached. I don't know. But then it says that, and it came to pass when Eli thought of the ark of God, he fell from his seat backwards by the side of the gate, and his neck broke, and he died. And he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. So thus thrusting Samuel into the spotlight as a young man. So there you have that Eli's sons were doing things that they shouldn't have done, that were against God. They knew it. Eli knew it. Didn't do anything to stop them, or didn't do enough to stop them. He didn't stop them, let's put it that way, because Eli allowed his sons to rob God. So he was also judged, for he was in the position to stop it, and that was his duty to stop it. But he looked the other way. So as a result, the ark was lost, and so was God's glory. Eli allowed his sons to rob God, so he was also judged. But it doesn't end there, because those who took the ark endured curses and went from house to house, and some died, and some kept pushing it to somebody else. Here, you take the ark. No, you take the ark. No, I don't want it. But I begin to see a connection with this, what we're going through with our elections and within government and even in just our day-to-day life, is that you could be the one who did something wrong, as it appears very clear to me, and I think it's clear to most people who can actually see the evidence that much of the media keeps saying that there is none, that there was election. And that's the case anytime. When that was the problem I had right away with somebody saying that there's no election, there's no such thing as election. There's always election. In every election, there's going to be mistakes. In every election, there's going to be fraud. There's many different ways that election can take place, but it's always going to be to some degree in every election. That's a given. So it's one thing to be the person who commits the fraud, one thing to be the person who commits the sin or that commits an act against God. But it's another thing to be the one who is in charge of fixing that or making sure that doesn't happen and not doing your duty. So for the person who is there to investigate the voter who doesn't investigate, they're just as guilty as the person who committed it. The person who has the duty to see that it is a fair election and they don't do their duty, they are just as guilty as the one who committed. The person who witnessed the fraud, who doesn't speak out, just as guilty. The judge who rules against something based on some sort of political agenda or what have you, but didn't let the truth come to light, they're just as guilty. And even the state legislature who allowed this to happen, or who in retrospect saw that it happened and doesn't act on it, they're just as guilty. Even if it's one legislator who has no other support, they owe it to the people to speak out. So as many years later, in fact the Bible says 20 years pass by, and Samuel says to the whole house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then rid yourselves of foreign gods and commit yourself to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So Israel puts away its other gods and serves the Lord only. Then Samuel said, assemble all Israel, and I will intercede with the Lord for you. This is the power of intercession here. And when they had assembled, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. On that day they fasted, and there they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel was the leader of Israel at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. And then when the Israelites heard it, they were afraid because of the Philistines, and they said to Samuel, do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines. So Samuel comes to the people with a word, and he says, if you return to God with all your heart and put away any other gods and prepare your heart unto the Lord and serve him only, then things will change. This is a good message for us today. What were those things again? If you return to the Lord with all your heart. So if you've slipped away from him, if you are not where you should be with him today, return to him with all your heart. Put away any other gods. And today it may not be that you have a physical God that something you are praying to, but you may still be worshiping something that could be in your day-to-day life. And if you will just pray to God and ask him to show you if you have allowed something else to come into your life that you have begun to worship, he will reveal it to you. It'll probably be the first thing that pops into your head and you'll know what that is. Or maybe it's something else that already know, that you've allowed to take that first place in your life, that you've placed above God. It could be a sport or sports in general. It could be entertainment of some sort, music, movies. It could be some sinful act or a lust of some sort. There's lots of things that could be your God of choice, but turn it over to God. So if you return to the Lord with all your heart, put away strange gods, stop worshiping other gods, don't have any other gods before him, then prepare your heart unto the Lord to draw in close to him, to talk with him, get to know the Lord, and serve him only. Serve him only. We are to serve no one else other than God. So then Samuel gathered all of Israel, and he interceded for them. Sometimes we need an intercessor. And there are those out there. Maybe you're an intercessor, someone who intercedes for others, stands in the gap on their behalf, who prays and lifts them up. And then they did some interesting things. It says that they poured out water before the Lord, which was this ritual of cleansing. So they went through this process to be cleansed. We have a process today of being cleansed, but it's not physically cleansing with water, but the Lord can cleanse us and take away those sins and wash us white as snow through the blood of the Lamb, through Jesus. And then they fasted. There's power in fasting. And if you haven't tried it, I suggest you do. There's many different kinds of fasting that you can try. There's abstaining from all food, and you can do that for a period of time. Set it out and say for a day. In this case, they fasted for a day. Sometimes people try a Daniel fast, or they fast by sacrificing, giving up something that's otherwise important to them, so that they can spend that time and that space in their person getting close with God, so there's not that something in between them and God. And the third thing that they did was to confess. They confessed that they had sinned against the Lord. So in this case, maybe we need to confess. And maybe it's not even for us personally. Maybe it's as a nation, the things that we've done, that we've sinned against God. And we can confess that and say, Lord, even though it wasn't me personally that did this or this, I allowed it to happen. I wasn't always quick to speak out on these things, and I therefore allowed the enemy to get a foothold. So Samuel judged the children of Israel. So there comes the Philistines to attack. They tell Samuel, keep praying, keep interceding for us. It's very important. Do not stop. For the Philistines were trying to take them at their lowest moment. This is what the enemy does. It tries to come in and take you at your lowest moment. And this is when Samuel offered up a lamb. I'm sure some of you already see the connection. So Samuel offered up a lamb as a sacrifice. Now, today, who is our lamb? Who is our sacrifice? Christ Jesus, the Lamb, the Son of God, who came and was sacrificed on the cross for us. So he is our sacrificial lamb. So if we plead the blood, if we go through Jesus, then God is there to cleanse us, take us back, give us new life with him, and to save us through those moments. And then it says that God thundered with a great thunder against the Philistines. So let's look at this again and see what Eli himself had not done wrong. But because he allowed his sons to continue unchecked, he too offended God. And it's like that if we know of somebody who is robbing God, and we are in a position to stop that from happening, and we do nothing, then we too would be guilty. So what if there was election, and if you were a witness to that, and you don't come forward, then you too are guilty. If you're a judge, and you don't rule to make things right, or you don't rule to uncover such, then you are guilty too. If you are a state legislature, and you allow this to go unchecked, then you are just as guilty. If you have a position in government where that you could do something to stop that from happening, or to rectify that when it does happen, and you don't, then you are just as guilty. If you're a state legislature, and you allow this to continue or to happen, and you don't stop it or rectify the situation, you're just as guilty. Because just as Eli, who was in a position to stop this from happening, and he didn't stop it, he was also judged for that. Now we'll look at we the people, because Samuel came to the people and told them what they should do. That they needed to return to God with all their heart. That they needed to rid themselves of all other gods. That they needed to commit themselves to God and serve him only. And that's what we need to do today. Even in this time of turmoil and unease and unrest, and we're not sure what's going to happen with our country, we need to return to God. We need to rid ourselves of other gods, and we need to commit ourselves to serve only him. Then this is where Samuel interceded for the people, and we have people who can intercede for us today, who can stand in the gap. And maybe you might be one of those people who can stand in the gap, to cry out for the people, to cry out for our nation, to cry out for the wrongs that have taken place, for turning away from God, and to commit to him once again. It's been 400 years since the Mayflower Compact. And at this turning point of our nation, are we going to turn back to God as we did initially when they made that compact, that covenant with God? Or are we going to fully turn from God? And that's the point we're at right now. where it's turning away from God totally, or turning back to God totally. For we begin to stray our eyes away from Him, and we're at a point where we can totally go away or we can totally go back. And there's a reason why it's 400 years. That number is important. And then He called for them to be cleansed, to fast, to confess, even if they were confessing the sins that they didn't personally do, but were done as a people. And that's where we are as a nation, that we need to be cleansed. We need to fast. We need to confess past sins, even if we didn't personally do them, but as a nation we did. And that could be against the Native Americans. It could be sins against African Americans, against slavery. It could be confessing that we've allowed child sacrifice to continue, allowed human trafficking to be prevalent. And we've turned a blind eye to many of these things. And then finally, we need to recognize that Jesus is our Lamb who sacrificed for us, and we cling to Him, to cling to the blood of Jesus and His victory today. This has been the encouraging word.